Hey guys, it's chapter 15, the Reconstruction period from 1865 to 1877. We're going to be looking at the Reconstruction plans right after the Civil War, the Freedmen's Bureau, Civil War and Reconstruction legislation. We'll talk about Andrew Jackson and the Radical Republicans. We'll move on and talk about President Ulysses S. Grant, Black progress and oppression during Reconstruction, the economy. The next president will be Ruther B. Hayes, and the end of Reconstruction and the legacy of Reconstruction. So recall, Reconstruction was the process to try to rebuild the country, particularly the South, and try to unite the country one more time. Before Lincoln is assassinated, he launches his Lincoln's 10% plan. And this is what it called for: amnesty to most ex-Confederate soldiers, a 10% loyalty. So after 10% of each southern state's promise to be loyal to the United States, that particular southern state could be readmitted to the Union. And each state also had to ratify the 13th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment, all it said was that slavery was banned along with indentured servitude. So that was Lincoln's 10% plan. The Republicans in Congress didn't like Lincoln's 10% plan. They thought it was too easy. So they passed their own plan, which was called the Wade-Davis Bill. The Wade-Davis Bill called for 50% loyalty of each southern state in order to rejoin the Union. They also wanted new southern governments. People who did not serve in the Confederate Army were the people that were supposed to be composed part of the new southern government. They also asked for permanent disenfranchisement of Confederate leaders, meaning any Confederate leader who participated during the war was not able to vote. That's what disenfranchisement means. Also, the ratification of the 13th Amendment. That bill did not go through because Lincoln shut it down. He vetoed the Wade-Davis bill. When they were arguing about how to best reconstruct the country, Lincoln is assassinated, so his vice president, Andrew Johnson, becomes president. And his plan, it becomes known as the Johnson-Lenient Plan. He also called for 10% loyalty oath and ratification of the 13th Amendment. Each southern state needed to do that. He asked for amnesty to ex-Confederate soldiers, pardon or free ex-Confederate leaders and forgive them, and to return all land to Confederate soldiers. Now this was very controversial because in essence, Johnson was willing to return lands to those people who betrayed the Union, yet he denied land to loyal African Americans who never betrayed the Union. So it was very controversial. Again, that's the 13th Amendment, and part of the Reconstruction plan was this. You see, what we see here is Lady Columbia, which represents the United States. She's sitting on the throne here and standing up here. These are all Confederate leaders on some four. You see Robert E. Lee, who was a Confederate general. Alexander Stephens, he was the vice president of the Confederate States of America. And other prominent leaders were Roger Pryor, who was a lawyer from Virginia and a soldier of the Confederates. So they're all asking to be forgiven by the federal government. The question was, should Lady Liberty or Columbia be able to grant pardons and forgive all these Confederate soldiers and give them their rights, yet not give this African American who fought during the Civil War, lost his leg, not give him the same rights as these Confederate soldiers? That was a question. So Reconstruction takes place. One of the first things that Congress did on March 3rd, 1865, so about a month before the Civil War ends, they approved what becomes known as the Freedmen's Bureau. It's an organization whose goal was to help blacks and poor whites with food, clothing, shelter, medical care, education, and to reunite all these people who were displaced by the war and reunite them with their family. The Freedmen's Bureau was also launched to investigate Southern abuses towards blacks. The Freedmen's Bureau gave economic advice to African Americans, and if there was differences between blacks and whites in the South, the Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to help reconcile those differences. And the major thing that the Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to do was educate African Americans and poor whites, establish schools and colleges as well. Unfortunately, the Freedmen's Bureau failed to provide land to blacks. And remember, that goes back with Johnson giving land to ex-Confederate soldiers but denying it to blacks and African Americans. This is a political cartoon that shows African Americans being educated after the Civil War. You see people of all ages and you see a white woman who was most likely considered a carpetbagger. Carpetbagger was the name given to Northerners who came down south in search for political or economic reasons or careers. So she most likely is considered a carpetbagger trying to educate African Americans. She's white and they're all black. Now, there was criticism that the Freedmen's Bureau was going to create laziness among African Americans, and this political cartoon clearly displays that. So you see this African Americans who is supposed to be getting welfare from the Freedmen's Bureau, getting money and land, and you see whites working and harvesting the land. So there was a criticism, not very true in terms of the criticism that they were trying to pass. This predominantly was white Southerners who were arguing against the Freedmen's Bureau. We do have major legislation. The three red here are the amendments. They're called the Civil War Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So we already talked about the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery and indentured servitude. Congress, the Republicans in the North, and remember Andrew Johnson was a Democrat. So Congress tried to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which considered enslaved people citizens. In addition, it provided equal protection to all citizens, meaning enslaved people, African Americans, were now to be protected, and they were given full access to court to defend themselves and to serve on juries. Initially, the Civil Rights Act was not going to pass, but Congress was successful in pushing for the Civil Rights Acts to become the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment pretty much says the same thing as the Civil Rights Acts. All persons born in the U.S. are considered citizens. That includes blacks and ex-enslaved people. All citizens had equal protection under the law, and citizens cannot be denied their rights without due process, meaning going to court. So the Civil Rights Act becomes the 14th Amendment. Now, we also have the Reconstruction Act of 1867. What it did, and I'll explain that a little bit more in detail, it divided the South into 5 military districts, each under the command of a U.S. general. So this is a map that shows you that. So this is District 1, it's just Virginia. District 2 is the Carolinas. District 3, these 3 states. District 4, these 4 states. And District 5 is Texas all by itself. So the South was divided into 5 military districts. Now, each district was supposed to grant suffrage to freedmen and disenfranchised ex-Confederate leaders. Each district was supposed to ratify the 14th Amendment, which we just discussed, and eliminate black codes, which I'll discuss in later. And once each district did that, they were allowed to join the Union and have the same rights as any other states that they did. It was a bold plan by Republicans because they wanted actual change. And for the most part, it was successful. The last piece of legislation that we're going to talk about here is the 15th Amendment. So the 15th Amendment stated that states cannot deny anyone the right to vote on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In other words, it was providing for manhood suffrage. And it was very successful. One of the most successful pieces of legislation of the Reconstruction era. The problem with that, it left out women. Women were denied suffrage after all the struggles dating back to the Seneca Falls Conventions. They were unable to gain suffrage. It would take another 50 years for women to be able to do that. Now, some women were okay with the 15th Amendment. Other ones were not. So the women's rights movement actually split between those who favored the 15th Amendment and those who opposed it. But for now, the 15th Amendment did provide manhood suffrage. In particular, blacks were now able to vote. Very successful piece of legislation regarding the Reconstruction era. President Andrew Jackson, he favored Southern white power. He was from the South. He pardoned ex-aristocrats. These were people who were in power before the Civil War, and it could be argued that because of them, the Civil War started. These aristocrats wanted to regain control of the South, political power, and Johnson was all in favor of them. Johnson did not want the Freedmen's Bureau, so he vetoed it. He did not want the Civil Rights Act, which became the 14th Amendment, so he vetoed it. And he did not like the Reconstruction Act either. So all these things that were supposed to benefit African Americans, Andrew Johnson tried to veto. But Congress overrode each and every one of his vetoes, and this is why the Freedmen's Bureau was passed, the 14th Amendment was passed, as well as the Reconstruction Act. Now, Andrew Jackson is a unique person. He was hated by Republicans because he was a Democrat. Remember, Johnson was vice president Abraham Lincoln, who was a Republican. He was also disliked by Southerners because Andrew Jackson refused to secede with Tennessee when Tennessee seceded. So he was the wrong man at the wrong time. Andrew Johnson, political cartoon here, he is vetoing the Freedmen's Bureau, kicking them out, did not want to extend funding for them. Congress overrode his veto. This is another very common political cartoon. So you see an African American man who is, through the 15th Amendment, voting. He is voting for the Republican Mayor Welch. And next to him is the white man's ticket, the mayor who is supposed to grant favor for the whites. Notice the white man's box is empty. The Republican box, the Republican becomes known as the Negro Party. That is also known as the Lincoln's Party, because the Republicans were looking for the benefit of African Americans. This is Andrew Johnson. He has his veto powers here. Next to him is an ex-Confederate general, and Johnson has more veto ballots here to try to veto anything that was going to be passed to favor African Americans. So not a very successful president in terms of trying to help African Americans. His political stance leads to a political battle between Andrew Jackson and the radical Republicans. So Jackson was a Southern Democrat. So radical Republicans, for the most part, were mainly Northerners. Some Southern Republicans. Johnson wanted a lenient plan. Radical Republicans wanted a strict plan. Johnson wanted quick reconstruction. Radical Republicans wanted real reconstruction. Johnson was friendly towards the South, and he allied with ex-Confederate generals. Radical Republicans were hostile toward Confederate generals. Andrew Jackson wanted the U.S. government to be a government ruled by whites. Radical Republicans wanted governments for blacks and whites. Andrew Jackson favored black coats, which I'll talk later. Radical Republicans overrode every one of Johnson's veto. So there was conflict between these two people, or rather say between the president and Congress. A lot of conflict. Eventually, Andrew Jackson runs out of his time in office, so a new president is elected. This is President Ulysses S. Grant. He is a Republican. He's elected president in 1868 and again wins re-election in 1872. Under Ulysses S. Grant, the 15th Amendment is passed, which granted manhood suffrage. But Ulysses S. Grant's presidency is plagued by economic scandals, which we'll talk a little bit later, in particular the economic depression of 1873. Under his presidency also we have redemption. This is Southern Democrats who started to take back power in the South and unfortunately began to oppress African Americans. But before this, we do have Black progress. So African Americans were able to be a little bit successful under the Union League. This was a black organization who fought for blacks' needs. They represented Congress with grievances that blacks had. They built schools and led to college graduations by blacks, and they recruited a militia to protect black communities. There's also political successes and progress for African Americans. Hiram Revels becomes the first black senator, followed by Blanche Bruce. He becomes the second black senator. They're both from Mississippi, which is part of the Deep South. Several African Americans become lieutenants, governors, mayors, and sheriffs. So we see some progress for African Americans. The black community, in particular the churches, they become the center of community, not only as places of worship, but also schools, social centers, and meeting halls. And this is where African Americans feel at home. This is where they feel most safe. So black churches become the havens for African Americans during Reconstruction. In terms of the economy, African Americans do progress. They're able to establish businesses, become entrepreneurs. Some are able to make so much money that they are able to buy land as well. Finally, black oppression during Reconstruction. In 1865, Southerners passed black codes, which restricted African Americans' freedom, and that led to riots as well in black communities. Whites murdered over 24 political black leaders and Republicans. They burned their homes and schools that were established by the Freedmen's Bureau. They beat teachers, white or black, and black leaders as well. They echoed Johnson's words that government is and will always be a white government. Whites in the South, in particular Southern Democrats, began to disenfranchise African Americans by establishing poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clause. They denied blacks land, government jobs, economic opportunities, and terminated Reconstruction programs and cut funding. And of course, the one group that stands out is the Ku Klux Klan with their terrorist tactics, attacking African Americans and anybody who favor the African American community.